Welcome back, college football fanatics. It's your host, College Football with Sam. And because I know all of you are dying for college football content, as am I am going to gift to you my Big Ten predictions as of the month of April. And due to the fact that the transfer portal opened up yesterday, there's going to be tons of chaos with no transfer rules and the name, image, and likeness Wild West that we have out here. I would classify these predictions as almost way too early predictions in and of themselves. And while spring practice in the past would typically tell us if we had to change our predictions and our thoughts on the state of college football, its programs, and specific teams and rosters and coaching staffs, I think now moving forward, unless radical changes are made, spring practice will be the telltale of when we have to change our predictions. Expect to see in future Big Ten prediction videos and top 25 videos and other content I do that involves predictions, projections, or any type of college football content, period, that my opinions and thoughts and predictions, of course, are very much subject to change, especially given the fact that we could have and will have massive roster movement across different teams. In fact, some of your teams and potentially my own team in Michigan could absolutely suffer or potentially feast from this upcoming and now ongoing transfer portal cycle. So sit back, relax, enjoy the show, and let's have some fun. But before we do so, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so that you won't miss when I release more college football and especially Big Ten football content. There are going to be several more Big Ten prediction videos, an all Big Ten team video, and even making specific prediction videos for individual Big Ten teams. So that's all coming this summer, this preseason, the second part of the preseason after the portal closes, and this regular season are going to be so fun with all the different changes that I intend on covering. But first and foremost, you can skip this part if you want. I do want to discuss some polls that I took on Google Forms and on my YouTube community section in preparation for this video. First and foremost, who did my viewers think would have the best defense in the Big Ten this upcoming season? The overwhelming answer was Ohio State. They received 78 out of 165 votes on my Google Forms. Michigan won the vote on my YouTube community poll, but while the YouTube community poll is larger, that's more quick answers, and I get the feeling that people who want to give more detailed answers or have more detailed thoughts are going to use Google Forms, which is why I really like Google Forms, because I could ask a variety of questions or release a poll on who did you all think would have the best defense and list all 18 teams instead of the 4 teams that I thought you would believe would have the best defense this upcoming season, if that makes any sense. Ohio State was voted first by a mile on Google Forms. On the YouTube poll, Michigan was the slight favorite with 2,100 votes out of 5,000. Ohio State, though, did receive 1,750, and I do think Michigan and Ohio State will field some of the best defenses, if not the top 2 best defenses in all of college football this season. On Google Forms, other schools that received a significant amount of votes were Michigan with 35, Nebraska with 24, and Oregon with 8. And interestingly enough, those 4 schools plus Iowa were ranked in the top 8 of all defenses for the 2024 season projected by 24/7 Sports. In fact, it was, I think, Michigan 1, Ohio State 2, Iowa 3, and Oregon 4, if I remember correctly, but I don't know if I remember correctly. And that was the top 4, all Big Ten defenses. It was a shock, in fact, to see Oregon ahead of Georgia. But to get back on topic, my viewers on Google Forms and on my YouTube poll thought that Ohio State would field the best Big Ten offense. Ohio State received, again, no coincidence there, just happened, 70 out of 165 votes on my Google Forms poll to field the best Big Ten offense. Oregon was a very close second, receiving about 40% of the votes. And on the YouTube poll, Ohio State was voted the best offense by a whopping 2,520 votes out of 4,200. Oregon was again second, but not a close second. Many in the comments section mentioned Michigan in the comments of that YouTube poll, but I didn't include them in the YouTube poll because they lose 10 out of 11 starters, and they haven't used the portal yet, and it sounds like the staff really wants to use the portal because they're not satisfied, particularly with the skill positions outside of running back and tight end. So they're looking for receivers and QBs in the portal, from what it sounds like from the Michigan end. Other schools that received votes in the Google Forms were Michigan with 12, USC with 6, and any other votes that were received, like I think Michigan State had about 4, had less than 5, so I didn't think that was a significant amount. Who fielded the best special teams, or who is thought to field the best special teams this upcoming season? Well, I didn't release a YouTube poll for this, but on Google Forms, the majority of people thought it was going to be Iowa, or it is going to be Iowa. Pardon my incorrect use of past tense. 45 out of 165 votes is what Iowa received. They're projected, therefore, to field the best special teams unit in the Big Ten by my audience. Only 165 total votes, though. So the next time I release those Google Form polls, I want as many of you to participate as possible. It seriously doesn't take that much time, and it helps me to gauge what you all are thinking. YouTube does as well, but Google Forms allows for more diverse answers, and with the Big Ten Conference and any college football conference being large and having a variety of different teams, I do think it is a better way to measure opinions. The vote was divided, though, on special teams. Iowa simply received a plurality. Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon received 20 or more votes for the best special teams unit. Rutgers, Penn State, Nebraska, and Michigan State got at least 5 or more votes in this poll, and almost every team received at least 1 vote. So the opinion on who will have the best special teams unit, very divided, but I overall do agree that it will be Iowa. And with Ohio State on defense, I can agree with that. I could also see Michigan having the best defense, and for offense, I could see USC, Oregon, Ohio State. I would lean Oregon and Ohio State over USC, but I could see the Trojans taking that. And I could also see Penn State maybe with Andy Kotelnicki taking that. But without further ado, let's actually dive into the teams so I can give my record prediction and also a few seconds of just brief thoughts. But before we do that, thank you to my patrons for sponsoring this channel and this video. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can sign up as an All-American or Heisman patron, and you'll get bonus content that's bi-weekly. Will hopefully ramp up, especially when I finish my potential power system. That'll be very much involved and intertwined with my Patreon page. You can get bonus content with the All-American or Heisman membership. If you just want to be featured at the beginning or sometimes middle and always end of the video and always given a shout out at the end, you can sign up as an all-conference member. You can also support the channel by purchasing merchandise via the link in the description or the pinned comment. And the link to my Patreon page is also in the description and the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. But let's dive in. We got Indiana at 18th, last place. They have a new head coach in Kirk Cignetti and pretty much a new roster. I think that their best position is going to be wide receiver, highlighted by Donovan McCulley, and quarterback, highlighted by Curtis Roque, who is transferring in from Ohio. He had a little bit of a down year last year, but I think a lot of that was due to a brutal head injury that he sustained at the beginning of the season. I think Indiana is going to go 3-9, 0-9 in the Big Ten. Their schedule is as follows: FIU, Western Illinois, at UCLA, Charlotte, Maryland, at Northwestern, Nebraska, Washington, Michigan State, Michigan, at Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and then they close out the season with Purdue. I think they will only beat Florida International, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. This will be a rebuilding year for Indiana, though given all the incoming transfers, what I think is an underrated staff, and Kurt Cignetti's reputation now at James Madison of building championship defenses at the FCS level and efficient defenses in the FBS. Who knows? In my next Big Ten predictions video, perhaps I'll even have them going bowling. Indiana could surprise some people this year. We have the Maryland Terrapins also going 3-9, except they're going to achieve a conference win in exchange for receiving a non-conference loss. Their strongest room is going to be wide receiver, I think by a mile, and then quarterback, running back, and special teams will also be areas of interest. There's an intriguing quarterback battle going on between Billy Edwards and MJ Morris. At wide receiver, Caden Prather comes back, and I think Ty Felton is back as well, so that should be one of the better wide receiver rooms in the Big Ten overall. And of course, Roman Hemby returns at running back, but they lose a lot on the offensive line. Tight end Corey Dyches enters the portal, and their defensive back room for now 2 years in a row has lost NFL players. So I think this is going to be a rebuilding year. Their schedule is UConn, Michigan State, at Virginia, Villanova, at Illinois, Northwestern, USC, at Minnesota, at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, and they close out the year at Penn State. I think Maryland will beat UConn, Villanova, and Indiana on the road, but lose all of their other games. Like Indiana, I could see them pulling off more wins. Loxley does have a knack for good development. I just think with the loss of production and the fact that Loxley isn't a very good game manager, those two things are a bad combination, and I don't think Loxley will be able to compensate for the massive drop in returning production, especially when Talia Tagovailoa was their best quarterback by a mile, and he was just average by college football standards, or maybe above average. At 16th, we have the UCLA Bruins. Again, 3-9, 1-8 in the Big Ten, 16th in my arrangement based off of strength of conference record. That's how the tie-breaking system is going to work now, especially if teams don't face each other head-to-head. If there are two teams that are tied and they don't face each other, or three or more teams that are tied regardless, the strength of their opponents' conference records combined will determine who is placed in front, if that makes any sense. UCLA has, I think, a deep tight end room, and they also have Ethan Garbers at quarterback, and their receiver room and offensive line, specifically on the interior, is something to pay attention to. Spencer Holstage is one of the better guards in the country and in the Big Ten. Their staff is relatively new, and they did lose a lot at running back. They lost defensive coordinator DeAnton Lynn and much of their defense in secondary. And I thought that Chip Kelly was going to be fired entering this year. Well, then he went to Ohio State to be their offensive coordinator, and they hired Deshaun Foster. Now, I still think UCLA is in bad shape, and it will be Foster's mess to clean up, but at least they have some stability at head coach, and hopefully Foster is given an appropriate amount of time to try and rebuild this program. UCLA's schedule is at Hawaii, Indiana, at LSU, Oregon, at Penn State, Minnesota, at Rutgers, at Nebraska, Iowa, at Washington, USC, and Fresno State. I think they beat Hawaii, Indiana, and Fresno State to close out the year. They have a gauntlet of a schedule, though, and I just don't think they have the talent or coaching right now to beat most Big Ten teams. Up next, in 15th place in the Big Ten, and the final Big Ten team that I have missing a bowl game, the Purdue Boilermakers. I am a fan of Ryan Walters. I think that he is a coach and a man who prefers to operate in silence rather than be bombastic, and I appreciate that. The offensive line with Gus Hartwig returning at center along with some other players, and Dylan Thieneman being joined by a highly talented Nyland Green should also make the secondary a point of emphasis. Special teams doesn't look to be good right now, and also, for fair note, this video and these rankings are being made in mind before spring games were even played. Skill positions, I don't think are very good at Purdue. They have some underrated receivers. I do like Maccabee, and Hudson Card I think does have good potential, but I need to see it in order to believe it. And for now, I have Purdue going 4-8, 2-7 in the Big Ten Conference. Their schedule is Indiana State, Notre Dame, at Oregon State, Nebraska, at Wisconsin, at Illinois, Oregon, Northwestern, at Ohio State, Penn State, at Michigan State, and they close out the year against Indiana. I think they'll beat Indiana State, Oregon State on the road, Northwestern and Indiana at home to close out the season. But they will lose all their other games because this is a gauntlet of a schedule, especially with Notre Dame in the non-conference. But I have to say it again, just because the Big Ten has so many teams. A lot of these smaller teams do return a good amount of production, or they've used the portal well. I wouldn't be shocked if a lot of these teams that I'm picking to have losing records or to be subpar were to surprise us, especially if they're able to capitalize on the transfer portal cycle that they've already utilized, or if they capitalize on this portal cycle, or there's just so much going on in 2024, so much that's changing. And I also do think that it will be somewhat of a down year, a lot like 2021 or 2007, which is why Northwestern, despite the fact that I have them going 7-6 and 3-6 in the conference, I think could potentially finish the year with 9 wins. And I'm dead serious about that. Potentially even 10. They have a deep tight end room. They're deep in their back 7. Very deep there. Linebacker, defensive back, special teams with A.J. Henning at returner, I think is an area of strength. Theron Johnson at corner and Xander Mueller at linebacker are 2 players to look at on defense. And Cam Porter returns at running back. A.J. Henning also works at receiver alongside of Bryce Kurtz. They have some underrated players in their top 10 in returning production. Thought that David Braun did a heck of a job last season, and there's a chance he'll do an even better job this year. For now, I have them taking a step back record-wise, but I think that they will be a better team overall. Their schedule is Miami of Ohio, Duke, Eastern Illinois, at Washington, Indiana, at Maryland, Wisconsin, at Iowa, at Purdue, Ohio State, at Michigan, Illinois, to close out the season. And I think they'll get 6 regular season wins against Miami of Ohio, Duke, Eastern Illinois, Indiana, at Maryland, and Illinois. And they will play Baylor in the Armed Forces Bowl, where they will win to finish 7-6, 3-6 in the Big Ten Conference. We have the Minnesota Golden Gophers here at 13th, going 7-6, 3-6 in conference, winning their bowl game exactly like Northwestern. Minnesota is going to have good depth at running back. They have Darius Taylor, but they brought in some incoming transfers. They brought in Max Brosmer at quarterback to replace the outgoing Ethan Kaliakmanis. On the offensive line with Quinn Carroll, Ariante Irsay, and at wide receiver with Daniel Jackson, and defensive back with Justin Wally. They have some players to pay attention to, and they also have Jaw Joyner on the defensive line. If Minnesota's staff has made the right replacements for outgoing defensive coordinator Joe Rossi, and for the previous year for the outgoing Kirk Shiraka, then combined with the experience of this roster and some of the upside they have, especially if Brosmer is the guy at quarterback, Minnesota does have a high ceiling. Their schedule is North Carolina, Rhode Island, Nevada, Iowa, at Michigan, USC, UCLA, Maryland, at Illinois, at Rutgers, Penn State, and they play at rival Wisconsin to close out the season. I don't think that PJ Fleck, for now, again, this video and these predictions are very much subject to change. I don't think they'll beat rival Wisconsin or Iowa for now, but I do think that they will guarantee their bowl eligibility, unlike last year where they had to rely on academic progress rate. They'll be back in the Quick Lane Bowl, beating Miami of Ohio or another above-average MAC school, but they'll actually finish with a winning record this year instead of just barely below a 500 record. At 12th in the Big Ten Conference, we have the Illinois Fighting Illini. I have them going 6-7, gaining bowl eligibility, but losing in the Guaranteed Rate Bowl versus TCU. And I also have the Fighting Illini under Brett Bielema going 3-6 in Big Ten Conference play. Illinois' staff, their tight end room, their defensive line, and I even think their offensive line, with center Josh Kurtz returning, are key areas to pay attention to. Their running back room and wide receiver room have some questions, and Luke Altmaier, I think, is probably the worst quarterback in the Big Ten, or one of the worst. Some may say, well, that's Deacon Hill, but it's going to be Cade McNamara starting. Make no mistake about that. If Deacon Hill were starting, though, yeah, absolutely, he would be worst by a mile. But we're talking about Illinois here. The problem is there isn't a whole lot to talk about, at least right now. I think Illinois is more so in a similar situation to the Big Ten teams that I don't think will go bowling. The difference is I think Brett Bielema will find ways to win, especially in opportunistic moments. Illinois' schedule is Eastern Illinois, Kansas, Central Michigan, at Nebraska, at Penn State, Purdue, Michigan, at Oregon, Minnesota, Michigan State, Rutgers, Northwestern to close out the season. And I think, again, they'll play TCU in the Guaranteed Rate Bowl, in which they will lose. Kansas, Minnesota, and Michigan State. Those are 3 games I have Illinois winning. And full disclosure, I think all of those teams will be better than Illinois. But because Illinois is hosting them, because Illinois, for example, under Brett Bielema has owned PJ Fleck going 3-0 against them, and I think there's a good shot Illinois is more physical than Kansas this year, I think that Illinois will play their cards right and find ways to win under Brett Bielema, bringing them to bowl eligibility. At 11th, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I'm predicting them to go bowling. I'm putting that out there right now. But I've done this now for 4 years in a row, and I say that confidently because I'm not having Nebraska going bowling this upcoming season. I may change my record predictions or bowl eligibility for other teams, but we're getting in the 4-5 conference record and up areas, and at that point it's unlikely that I'll bring a team with 4 Big Ten conference wins all the way down to missing a bowl game. I have Nebraska going 8-4, 4-5 in Big Ten Conference play. Tight end with Thomas Fidone is an area of strength. The defensive line with Nash Hutmacher, who I have as a first-team All-Big Ten defensive tackle, that's an area of strength. And defensive back with Tommy Hill, Malcolm Hartzog, and Isaac Gifford. Watch out there. Running back with Emmett Johnson, Gabe Irvin Jr., and Ramir Johnson, likely in my next Big Ten prediction video, will be in the A grade range. I think that's an area where there's a lot of optimism. Same with quarterback. I think in retrospect, after reading some things about Nebraska's practices from experts and also from basic opinion, I think I'm underrating the quarterback room in this video. But not to worry, this is all subject to change. Nebraska's schedule is as follows: UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois, at Purdue, Rutgers, at Indiana, at Ohio State, UCLA, USC, Wisconsin, and they close out the year at rival Iowa. I think Matt Rule will once again lose in some close games this season, particularly to a team like Iowa, Wisconsin, Rutgers at home, and I don't think a game at Ohio State or even at USC will be particularly close. But they will take steps forward, go bowling, and they could be undefeated entering that Ohio State game. They absolutely could beat Rutgers, though at the same time, Nebraska could lose to some teams that I have them beating on their schedule. All just depends on turnovers and how the roster is compared to last season. But given their returning production and their use of the portal, I think they should improve in a big way. At 10th, we have the USC Trojans. I can already feel the sweat dripping from some people's faces onto their keyboards in reaction to this placement. But alas, I have USC going 7-6, 4-5 in Big Ten Conference play. Wow. We've really gotten to this point with USC, haven't we? But honestly, joining a very physical conference that's elite with defense and a conference who even the most incompetent offenses can run the football and sometimes rather well, what else would you expect when you pit those teams all the way up to the elites at the top against a team that has poor trench play on both sides of the football and an offensive line that I think is more likely to be made of butter rather than to force you to eat the butter in the pizza, if you get what I mean. USC is quarterback, they are wide receiver, some running back, an elite offensive coordinator who's, I think, improving as a CEO in the moves he made on defense, and a good special teams unit with Zachariah Branch and a decent punter and a good kicker. That's really it. Now, I think USC has national championship potential, and their schedule is as follows: LSU at a neutral site, Utah State, at Michigan, Wisconsin, at Minnesota, Penn State, at Maryland, Rutgers, at Washington, Nebraska, at UCLA, and Notre Dame to close out the season. Ohio State and Oregon, the two favorites to win the Big Ten Conference, are off the list. So some would say this is a favorable draw for USC. But if USC's defense doesn't improve rather quickly, and it's hard to improve a disaster of a defense from disastrous to great in year one. Jim Knowles, it took him a year to build Ohio State into having an elite defense. I think it will be the same for D'Anton Lynn at USC. That defense will have a hard time against great rushing offenses, which Penn State, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, potentially LSU, Rutgers, Nebraska, maybe Notre Dame, and certainly Virginia Tech, who I have USC playing in the Holiday Bowl. All of those teams will be able to run the ball down an average defense's throat. And USC's defense, especially at the beginning of the season, I think will have an average defense. I think the Trojans will go, again, 7-6, 4-5 in conference. I think they'll beat LSU in an upset, Utah State, at Maryland, Rutgers, Nebraska, UCLA, and Notre Dame, and potentially another upset. They will improve as a team compared to the prior season, but I think take a step back record-wise. And I wanted to spend time on USC because they are an intriguing storyline to follow, more than potentially any team in the Big Ten outside of the top 3 or 4 teams who I'll also spend significant time on in this video. We have Michigan State up next. I have the Spartans going 8-5, 4-5 in Big Ten conference play. 9th in Big Ten record rankings. I think they have one of the best staffs in all of college football. I think Jonathan Smith is a top 10 head coach. Brian Lindgren is a top 10 offensive coordinator. I think Joe Rossi is a top 20, top 25 defensive coordinator. And Mike McDonald, their strength and conditioning coach, is also top 10 in his profession. Combine all of that, you have one of the best staffs in the country and in the Big Ten. I think that quarterback with Aiden Childs will be an area of strength. Tight end with Jack Velling will be an area of strength. Same with Brennan Parashek. Defensive line with Simeon Barrow, with Chris Bogle, they're so deep at the defensive line. It's honestly unfair compared to the school who has the average talent level that MSU does. Derek Harmon is someone else to watch on the interior defensive line. Special teams with Jonathan Kim and Ryan Eckley. That could be the best kicker and punter duo in the Big Ten. And I like Nathan Carter at running back. And their offensive line with Tanner Miller at center has potential as well. This is a very boom or bust team, not to the degree that USC is, nor do they have the same amount of pressure that Lincoln Riley and USC do. But nonetheless, they have a high ceiling, but also the potential to have a very low floor as well. Although, again, unlike USC, who could win it all this year or also have a losing record, Michigan State could have a losing record or at best maybe get 10 wins with a bowl game win. Michigan State's schedule is Florida Atlantic at Maryland, Louisiana at Boston College, Ohio State at Oregon, Iowa at Michigan, Indiana at Illinois, Purdue, and Rutgers to close out the year. I think Michigan State will beat Florida Atlantic, Maryland, Louisiana, Boston College, Iowa in an upset, Indiana, Purdue, and they'll beat Syracuse in the Pinstripe Bowl. At 8th, we have the Washington Huskies. Now, this is a team that I'm ever learning about. They lost 21 out of 22 offensive and defensive starters last season. They have a new head coach in Jed Fish. They made an interesting hire on defensive coordinator in Steve Belichick. I don't know a ton about this team, but what I do know is Jed Fish is a good coach. I think he built a good staff. Ron McKeefrey is still their strength and conditioning coach there with the Huskies. So I think their staff is probably the strongest point of their team. And their quarterback room, their running back room, I think at skill positions they'll be good. I have some concerns on defense and at the receiver position, mostly at tight end and the O-line, due to the sheer amount of outgoing production. But I do think that the Huskies have a shot to really retain the level of success that they've had on average over the past decade. Not winning it all or reaching the national championship game, but certainly being a top 25 team. Their schedule is Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State in a neutral site, their main rival. Northwestern at Rutgers, Michigan at Iowa, at Indiana, USC, at Penn State, UCLA, and they finished the year against rival Oregon on the road. I think Washington will beat Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern, Indiana, USC in an upset, and UCLA. They will lose to a much superior Louisville team in the Duke's Mayo Bowl. At 7th in the Big Ten Conference, I have the Wisconsin Badgers. I overestimated the Badgers last season by picking them to go 10-2 in the regular season and reaching the Big Ten championship game to face off against Michigan. Michigan, I accurately predicted. They won the Big Ten, they won the national championship, and they did it all with a 15-0 record. However, I did not predict Wisconsin accurately at all. They finished the year 7-6. I thought that Wisconsin would go 11-3, of course, losing in Indy, but winning their bowl game, achieving that 11th win. Instead, it was Iowa who represented the West Division in its final year in the Big Ten championship game. Wisconsin is a great staff. I think Fickell's a top 10 head coach. I think Tressel and Phil Longo are top 25 coordinators in their respective positions. And I think the same about their strength and conditioning staff. Wisconsin does have some questions at running back, but they do have depth there. They bring in Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback, who struggled at Miami, but he has a high ceiling, and I think with better coaching and in a conference that isn't known for its quarterback play, he can succeed. Jake Renfro returns at center. Joe Huber should be an outstanding guard. Riley Bauman and Jack Nelson are only rivaled by Minnesota and Oregon's tackle rooms in the Big Ten, and heck, I would even say nationally. And on defense, they have some nice players as well. They bring in Tackett Curtis from USC at linebacker and Ricardo Hallman and Hunter Wohler. Man, I would say an underrated secondary and defensive back room. Wisconsin's schedule is Western Michigan, South Dakota, Alabama, at USC, Purdue, at Rutgers, at Northwestern, Penn State, at Iowa, Oregon, at Nebraska, and they close out the year, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, hosting rival Minnesota. This is a murderer's row of a schedule. It's not the toughest conference schedule in the Big Ten, but once you factor in the non-conference, and I have Alabama as a top 5 team entering this year, this is probably the toughest overall schedule in the Big Ten. Thankfully, Oregon, Penn State, and Alabama do play in Camp Randall, so if Wisconsin matches up against any of these teams in a decent way or a good way, they do have home field advantage on their side. I think they will match up in the Alamo Bowl against Kansas State, where they will beat the Wildcats, achieving their 9th win to go 9-4, 6-3 in the Big Ten Conference. At 6th, we have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, our first team who will be earning 10 wins. And not just 10 wins including the bowl game, but 10 wins in the regular season. Yes, I do think Rutgers achieves a 10-2, 7-2 record in Big Ten Conference play in the 12 games they have scheduled. Why is that? Well, their schedule is the polar opposite of Wisconsin's, which is why we're starting out with that instead of their roster. Their schedule is their best benefactor, is their best helper. It is as follows: Howard, Akron, at Virginia Tech, Washington, at Nebraska, Wisconsin, UCLA, at USC, Minnesota, at Maryland, Illinois, at Michigan State. Virginia Tech, and this is another team along with Rutgers who I'm paying closer attention to Rutgers because they're in the Big Ten, but I like Virginia Tech this year, and I think that they're going to contend for the ACC. Virginia Tech, the school that Frank Beamer built into a power and that now almost no one cares about, even though you should. They're number 2 in returning production, have a ridiculous run game, good O-line, underrated receiver core, and Brent Pry's a defensive mastermind. They should be on your radar this year. They might be the best team that Rutgers plays all year. In fact, by rankings, they would be second best, behind Wisconsin, in my own personal mind. When my top 25 video comes out, you'll see that I have Virginia Tech, at least as of now. The transfer portal again could change all this, but right now I have only Wisconsin out of this whole schedule ranked ahead of Virginia Tech. And USC on the road, that'll be tough as well. But I think Rutgers beats Howard, Akron, Virginia Tech, Washington, Nebraska, UCLA, Minnesota, Maryland, Illinois, and Michigan State. I think they'll play Ole Miss in the ReliaQuest Bowl, where they will lose, because I do think Ole Miss is a much better team than Rutgers. But due to the fact that Rutgers is an easy schedule, they will get 10 wins in the regular season, and they will be in prime position to have a prestigious bowl appearance. With their 10-2 schedule that's very easy, I'd have a hard time seeing them get into the college football playoff unless they go 11-1 or better. Rutgers has an underrated staff. I think Gavin Wimsatt will take a step forward this season. Kyle Monungai and Sammy Brown V playing behind an offensive line that returns 4 to 5 starters is going to be lethal. Look out for Christian Dremel at wide receiver. They have one of the best linebacker cores in the Big Ten with Mohamed Toure and Tyreen Powell. Flip Dixon and Robert Longerbeam are other players to watch on defense, along with edge rusher Aaron Lewis. Fifth, this is the final team we have in the Big Ten that is not reaching the college football playoff, and I think you already know who those 4 teams are, but let's sit back, wait for a few more minutes, and let's talk about Iowa here. Iowa also has a very workable schedule, like Rutgers. That's in part why I have them 5th in the Big Ten Conference. I think their staff has improved dramatically compared to last year. That's simply because Brian Ferentz is no longer the OC, and Tim Lester, who did produce some good offensive players during his time as the head coach at Western Michigan, I think, while not an elite OC, not even a great OC, is infinitely more capable of running and commanding an offense than Brian Ferentz is. And if Phil Parker's defenses continue to shine like they have ever since he's arrived at Iowa, a Phil Parker defense plus the defenses of Iowa, I would say before 2021, or offenses of Iowa before 2021 or 2020, rather, that could be a lethal team, and a team that could still contend for the Big Ten championship game for an appearance there, or even a college football playoff appearance, even without divisions anymore, and now having to face Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, sometimes all on the same schedule, other times just sparsed throughout their schedule. And that's the case this season. They only play Ohio State out of the Big Four, which are Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. And all 4 of those teams I have reaching the playoffs, as you've already deduced by now. Iowa's schedule is Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, at Minnesota, at Ohio State, tough back-to-back road stretch, Washington, at Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, at UCLA, at Maryland. They close out the year hosting rival Nebraska for the Heroes game. I have them matching up against LSU in the Citrus Bowl, which will be the best SEC and Big Ten team that does not reach the college football playoff. Like Ole Miss against Rutgers, I do think LSU is much better than Iowa, and therefore I'm picking them to win the Citrus Bowl, which Iowa will take their 3rd loss in. I have the Hawkeyes beating Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, Minnesota, Washington, Northwestern, Wisconsin, UCLA, Maryland, and Nebraska. The staff's improved. Cade McNamara will be better than Deacon Hill as long as he's healthy. They have an underrated collection of running backs with Caleb Johnson and LaShawn Williams. Wide receiver, I think, is one of the worst rooms in the country, but they do have some playmakers there that if everything goes right, they could be okay. Tight end with Lachey and Ostrenga is going to be awesome. Their offensive line returns all 5 of their starters, and if not for Caden Proctor deciding to return to Alabama, I might have had Iowa's offensive line as one of the best, if not the best in the country, or the Big Ten with all that they have returning, and they made strides from 2021 into 2023. Defensively, Nick Jackson returns at linebacker, along with Jay Higgins. I have them both on my 2nd team for Jackson and 1st team for Higgins, all Big Ten. Sebastian Castro, Germani Harris, Quinn Schulte, and Xavier Nwamkpa should man one of the best, if not the best, secondaries in the country. Drew Stevens comes back at kicker. There's just so much that could go right for Iowa, and I think that Brian Ferentz being replaced and Ferentz still coaching the team in spite of that, some speculated that he would retire as a reaction, I think is good for Iowa, especially in the near future. So pay attention to the Hawkeyes. I could see them beating Michigan State on the road. That would classify as an upset in favor of the Spartans, and if they go 11-1, they would reach the college football playoff, in my opinion, especially if they play Ohio State tight. At 4th in the Big Ten, we have the Oregon Ducks. Oregon, I have going 13-3. This is so weird to say because a 3-loss team, not in the college football playoff, because Oregon will have 2 losses entering the playoff, But a team that goes into the playoff finishing with 3 losses just sounds so foreign and weird and something that's mythical. But here we are with the expanded playoff, this will happen. There will be teams potentially in some years that reach with 3 losses into the playoff and they finish with 4. Now that is insane. Oregon, like USC, like UCLA, like Washington, they're a former Pac-12 school, but Oregon is the best built to succeed in the Big Ten because of their offensive line, because of their running back room. That's why. I don't know if they have the defense to be classified as elite. In fact, I'd lean on the fact that their defense is probably going to be great or near elite, but not elite. But Jordan James, he's an elite running back. Ipani Lalulu is going to start at center, and I think that he'll be great. They know how to just breed and develop offensive linemen there. I hope I pronounced his name right. Marcus Harper II should be a good guard, and a Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr. Those are elite guards. They both returned from last season. They're veterans. I think that Oregon will have some of the best pass protection for incoming quarterback Dylan Gabriel in the country. Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Gary Bryant Jr., and others will make one of the better wide receiver rooms in the country. Terrence Ferguson returns at tight end. And it's not even mentioning defensive players like Jordan Birch, Jamari Codwell, Jabbar Muhammad, who's transferring in from Washington. He's a great cornerback. Oregon's roster is deep. The only concern about their roster is special teams. Dan Lanning's sometimes overly emotional aggression reminds me a lot of Dan Campbell. You live by the 4th down and being aggressive. You die by it. That's what the regular season game against Washington last year showed us. Their special teams has a lot of questions. I said at the beginning of the video, it's quite a disgustingly inefficient special teams unit, but they do return a lot overall, Oregon does. So I think that they will improve. They're top 30 or maybe even top 25, if I remember correctly, in returning production. Their schedule is Idaho, Boise State, at Oregon State, at UCLA, Michigan State, Ohio State, at Purdue, Illinois, at Michigan, Maryland, Wisconsin. They close out the year against rival Washington. I think they beat Idaho, Boise State, Oregon State, UCLA, Michigan State, Purdue, Illinois, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Washington. I think they fall to Ohio State and Michigan because I think the Buckeyes and Wolverines will have as good of ground games as Oregon does while having better defenses. And in the Big Ten, in a matchup, a big-time matchup, if the defense is elite and you have a good run game, as long as you have just an okay passing game, the impact of an okay to very elite passing game doesn't matter too much. It's weird, but we've seen it with Ohio State against Michigan. We've even seen it with Ohio State against Penn State in 2022. Ohio State won, but it was their defense and ground game that pulled them away at the end. Stroud had a very efficient day, but that didn't cause Ohio State to beat Penn State that day. Oregon will make the playoff. I think they'll upset Alabama on the road in the first round, beat Florida State in the Peach Bowl, win a rematch against Michigan in the Cotton Bowl. They'll lose to Georgia in the national championship. I think that Oregon's aggression, their high-ceiling talent, their great quarterback play, which will be some of the best in the Big Ten, and their skill positions, they remind me a lot of Ohio State in 21 or 22, though they don't have the same elite quarterback play. They're built to play in the playoff and be fast-paced. Therefore, I think they'll make a deep run and compete for a national championship this year. At third, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. Penn State had a disappointing year last season. They went 10-3, lost to Ole Miss in the Peach Bowl in humiliating fashion. However, James Franklin has made some staff upgrades and moves. I like the addition of Andy Kotelnicki. I think right now he's the best offensive coordinator in all of college football. Consequently, I do think that Drew Aller will take a step forward this season. Nicholas Singleton, Quentin Martin Jr., and Katron Allen, that will make a deep running back room, perhaps the deepest and best in the country, depending on how things pan out. At wide receiver, that grade was given before Keandre Lambert-Smith transferred out, but they do bring in Julian Fleming. They return Tyler Warren at tight end. On the defensive line, Abdul Carter switches to defensive end, and they return much of their defensive tackles. And they return Kobe King at linebacker, who was pretty good last year. And they return Riley Thompson at punter. which Penn State has a wicked punter. Riley Thompson's really good at that position. Penn State's schedule is at West Virginia to open up the year, Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA, at USC, at Wisconsin, Ohio State, Washington, at Purdue, at Minnesota, Maryland to close out the season. Maryland, of course, thinks that's a rivalry. Penn State could care less. They don't view that as a rivalry. I think Penn State will beat everyone on their schedule: West Virginia, Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA, USC, Wisconsin, Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, and Maryland. They'll beat all of them except for Ohio State at home. And I think this is a game to pay attention to. I really do. Penn State, their schedule is very easy outside of that Ohio State game. And some may say, well, at USC and at West Virginia and at Minnesota, especially with Penn State's weakness in the trenches, could be hard. Same with at Wisconsin before Ohio State. That's a classic trap game. And I would say yes, except most of their defensive front returns. And last year's Penn State defense, while Michigan showed that they were not elite in stopping the run, their defense last year, particularly their front, was the most efficient I've ever seen from a Penn State defense. It was awesome. And much of that front, outside of Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac, return. And Abdul Carter, I think, is going to be a beast at defensive end. He's going to be awesome. And that was shown in the spring game, even though, again, this video is not made in mind with the spring game. So I think that Penn State's defense this year, what you have to pay attention to is the secondary. How will A.J. Harris and how will Jalen Kimber fit into that unit? Will corner be solid? If so, this could be the best defense in the country. If not, this at worst is probably a good, great defense that has a vulnerability to elite passing offenses. And the only team on this schedule that I can see having an elite passing offense is Ohio State or USC. That likely gives Penn State 10 wins, maybe 9 at the worst, which would be very disappointing. I think they reached the college football playoff with an 11-1 record, 8-1 record in conference. I have them going 12-2, beating Texas in a home playoff game in December, likely in the cold and wind in Beaver Stadium. And I also think, side note, that Penn State's just better than Texas this year. So Franklin will pick up a college football playoff win in his first appearance. However, they will fall to the Michigan Wolverines in the Rose Bowl. I still think that Michigan has matchup advantages over Penn State. And even though Penn State returns more than the Wolverines, I'm much more secure in Michigan's strength and conditioning and their defense and even their trench play, despite what they lose because of their reputation there. And I'm more secure in Sharon Moore's coaching. Speaking of Sharon Moore, we have the Michigan Wolverines at second place. Now, Sharon Moore is taking over a team that is outside the top 100 in returning production. I think Michigan is rough at wide receiver. And I've already heard reports as of yesterday that they're actually looking at bringing in Keandre Lambert-Smith, which tells you that they're rough at wide receiver. Lambert-Smith's a good playmaker and a good receiver, but he's not great. He's not elite. And he won't benefit, let's say, a USC, Ohio State, Oregon type wide receiver room. He wouldn't. But for Michigan, he would be an absolutely massive upgrade. Michigan's going to be targeting receivers, and I would say even some quarterbacks in the transfer portal. I think Michigan, the staff moves they've made, I wasn't elated with all of them, but that's because I want the best of the best. Wink Martindale is going to be a great defensive coordinator. Elite, I don't know, and I think in the long haul, Michigan may want a different DC, but right now, he knows the system. He built Michigan's defensive scheme. I think that's a good hire at this very moment. The strength and conditioning staff, Ben Herbert leaves, but his closest assistant, Justin Tress, takes over there. And I think Sharon Moore, I know I'm giving some benefit of the doubt here, but he helped build what Michigan has been over the past 3 seasons. And he's only managed a few games, hasn't managed a season, but I have faith in him, and I've liked what I've seen from him, so I think that he right now is a good head coach in college football. I think he's more likely to be a Ryan Day, where he takes over a good system and makes it even better, or at least maintains the level of success, than he is, let's say, to be a Larry Coker, who fizzles out and burns the program to the ground. Alex Orji looks to potentially start at quarterback, but what you should be paying attention more so to is Donovan Edwards at running back. Edwards wasn't fully healthy last season, at least at the beginning, and he was an impatient back last season, and I think that if he can continue the momentum that he had against Washington in that national championship game, I think he could be set to be the Big Ten's best running back this year. What's more important is looking at the defensive line, who returns Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, and Derek Moore. Graham was technically the only starter who comes back, but all three of those other players essentially played as rotational starters, much like what Ohio State has historically done on their defensive line. Michigan will have the best D-line in the country. Their offensive line won't be the best in the country just with how much they lose, but I still think it'll be one of the best units nationally. They bring in Josh Preby at guard, and they return Miles Hinton, who is a high ceiling as an offensive tackle. Colston Loveland might be the best tight end in the country this year. And at defensive back, they return Will Johnson, Quentin Johnson, Makari Page. They did return Rod Moore, but he sadly tore his ACL, so prayers up to him. And Tommy Doman should be a good punter. Michigan's schedule is Fresno State, Texas, Arkansas State, USC, Minnesota, at Washington, at Illinois, Michigan State, Oregon, at Indiana, Northwestern, and they close out at Ohio State in the game to end the regular season. Pardon me there, I'm stuffed up. I think that Michigan will fall to Ohio State this year. Ohio State is going to have revenge on their mind. It is a road trip. Ohio State returns so much more than Michigan does. And Ohio State's more physical than they were in 2022 when they returned more than Michigan and hosted them. So I think this is a year where Ryan Day, yes, will get a win over Michigan. But I think it'll be a hard-fought game. I don't think Ohio State will blow out Michigan, just like I didn't think that Michigan would blow out Ohio State last year. And yet here we are. Michigan, with Sharon Moore as offensive coordinator, has been 3-0 against Ohio State. And technically, in an acting head coach role, he already has a win over Ohio State. He'll lose to Ohio State the regular season. He'll beat Fresno State, Texas, Arkansas State, USC, Minnesota, at Washington, at Illinois, Michigan State, Oregon, at Indiana, Northwestern, losing to the Buckeyes at the end of the season. However, I do think Michigan will rematch against Ohio State due to the strength of their conference schedules for the Big Ten championship game, and I don't trust Ryan Day and Ohio State to beat Michigan back-to-back within a week's time, so I think Michigan will earn the win in the rematch in the Big Ten championship game, capturing their fourth Big Ten title in a row. They'll play Penn State in the Rose Bowl. They'll get that first-round bye. They'll beat Penn State in the Rose Bowl, but fall to Oregon in a rematch in the Cotton Bowl. I think Michigan will have some concerns at depth, particularly at skill position, and injuries are a part of the game, so I'm factoring that in. Michigan might be worn down by the time they play Oregon, and Oregon is a team built for the playoffs, so it's just not necessarily a good matchup, especially with the questions that Michigan has at defensive back, now that Rod Moore is going to be out for the season. And finally, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes here at first in the Big Ten with a 14-2 record, 9-0 in conference. Ryan Day will get that win over Michigan that he desperately needs. They've constructed one of the best staffs in the country. They have the best running back room in the country, in my opinion, with Travion Henderson, with Quinshon Judkins. Those are two options that anyone at any school would take. At quarterback, they're not where they were under C.J. Stroud or Justin Fields commanding the offense. But Will Howard, I think that he can do more than what Kyle McCord can do, especially in this new Chip Kelly system. And they have Devin Brown and Julian Sayin, who could potentially compete for the starting job as well. So they're deep at quarterback. At receiver, Emeka Egbuka returns, and Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith should step up in a big way this year. The offensive line has tons of questions, and I think that's ultimately Ohio State's kryptonite is their offensive line, and even their tight end play now that Cade Stover is leaving. Their defense could be the best in all of college football. They return Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, JT Tuimoloau, and Jack Sawyer. At linebacker, they return Cody Simon, and they move Sony Styles there from safety. They bring in Caleb Downs at safety for Ohio State, and they return Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock, Davison Igbinosun, and Lathan Ransom. I mean, this defense, especially the secondary, which I think Ohio State is the best secondary by a mile in college football. This defense is lethal, and it's going to be an NFL-style defense this year that's going to be conservative. However, they're going to be very stout. They're probably going to be number 1 in touchdowns per game allowed, and they'll be a clutch defense too. You have to pay attention to if they can be elite against the run, but with all they have returning, it's safer to say that they will be than they won't be. This will be Ryan Day's most physical team since the 2019 team. Their schedule is Southern Miss, Western Michigan, Marshall at Michigan State, Iowa at Oregon, Nebraska at Penn State, Purdue at Northwestern, Indiana. They close out the year hosting rival Michigan in the game. And I think that they'll rematch against Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State's 9-0. They're first with no ties, so they'd be a lock. And I do think that Michigan will have a tougher schedule in conference than Penn State will. So they get the nod. 8-1 Michigan in conference does over 8-1 Penn State. They rematch in Indy, where I think Michigan wins. Therefore, Michigan gets the bye, and Ohio State doesn't, despite the fact that I think Ohio State will be a better team than Michigan this coming season. It'll be rough for Ryan Day and for Ohio State fans, but they got that win over Michigan. They're in the college football playoff, and I do think that they will make a run. They'll beat Liberty, the best group of 5 team. They'll destroy them in the first round in Columbus. They'll beat Utah in what I think will be an interesting rematch in the Fiesta Bowl. And against Georgia, this is the semifinals. This is really a position where I think Ohio State's the second best team in the country. I have Georgia winning the national championship. But because of how seeding works, I think Ohio State will match up against Georgia in the semifinals, not the national championship game. And I have better trust in Georgia's coaching, their staff, their strength and conditioning, their offensive line. I think they have better quarterback play, better tight end play. And they've upgraded at running back. I think they've upgraded at receiver. And their defense could be better than last year. I don't know if Georgia will have the same O-line, if they'll have the same tight end room that they did last season. And I don't know about their defense. They lost, again, players on defense, specifically at secondary. So Georgia could be better than last year. They could be worse, but I think they're the best team in the country right now. So in the Orange Bowl, Ohio State will fall to Georgia. They will finish with a 14-2, 9-0 record in Big Ten conference play. That's all I have to say in this video, guys. I know it was long, but I think it was worth it. Thank you all so much for watching. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 for sponsoring this video and channel as a Heisman member. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video and channel as an All-American member. Thanks to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video and channel as all conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all around. Bye-bye.